The first FA Cup competition could be accurately described as organised chaos. When the first Football Association Challenge Cup kicked off in 1871, 15 clubs answered the call. By the end of the tournament, only 10 matches had actually been played. The rules were loose, the format was experimental, and almost immediately, things started to go wrong. Some teams didn't turn up, some couldn't afford to, and some simply couldn't find enough players on the day. Famously, the Wanderers took the trophy, beating the Royal Engineers in the final, but the real stories belong to the teams that came and went, and the few that stuck around. Here are the stories of the teams that competed in football's first organised cup competition. Let's start with the obscure ones. Hampstead Heathens. With a team name that wouldn't look out of place in Major League Soccer, the exquisitely Victorian Hampstead Heathens were actually a London-based social club. Football was just something they did. In the tournament, they beat Barnes in the first ever FA Cup replay, a victory that made them the first giant killers, starting a proud FA Cup tradition. They pushed on all the way to the quarter-finals before running into the well-oiled machine of the Royal Engineers, who proceeded to demolish them 3-0. So, what happened to Hampstead Heathens? In short, we don't know. There is no record of them entering any subsequent tournaments, and they resigned their FA membership in 1873. A real flash-in-the-pan team. Harrow Chequers. The equally interestingly named Harrow Chequers had a golden rule when it came to the FA Cup. Enter if you must, but under no circumstances should you ever kick a ball. They entered the first FA Cup tournament, and the next 5, but never fulfilled a single fixture, withdrawing each time. The Chequers, nonetheless, are significant to the sport of football. Charles W. Alcock, the mastermind behind the FA Cup, was a Harrow old boy, and the concept of a competitive football tournament was likely born at that illustrious school. The team also suffered the problem of sharing a player pool with other teams in the same tournament. This made their first fixture against the Wanderers slightly awkward. Though some players at the first FA Cup did play for different teams in the tournament, it was difficult for them to play for 2 different teams in the same match. In the first tournament final, it was a Harrow player, Morton Betts, who scored the winning goal. Unfortunately for Harrow, it just wasn't for their team. He scored the winner for Wanderers whilst playing under the not-so-subtle false name of Th Checker. The team was disbanded by 1876, and the new club, Old Harrovians, replaced them. Lausanne Football and Cricket Club. The first team to travel from overseas to compete in the FA Cup. At least, that is how they are often framed in popular vernacular, but it is unclear whether they were actually based in Switzerland. Little is known about them, but they are credited with being one of the oldest football clubs in the world and the oldest on the European continent. As the name suggests, like many early clubs, they were a mixed sports club rather than a football team. They never kicked a ball in the first FA Cup, but the team did eventually register for and compete in the Swiss Championship at the end of the 19th century before fading from the history books. Donington School. Picture this. You are the headmaster of a school in rural Lincolnshire. You feel your pupils could do with some exercise, so naturally, you enter them into the FA Cup. It sounds absurd, but this is exactly what happened with Donington School in the first tournament. This team of schoolboys, who were actually members of the Football Association for some reason, were given the daunting task of taking on one of the most famous teams in football, Queen's Park, in the first round. No pressure. At first, the tie was null and void because the two sides could not agree on a venue for the fixture. To solve this problem, Queen's Park invited the plucky school team to Glasgow. Perhaps fortunately for the young lads, their headmaster decided they couldn't afford the train fare and spared their blushes. They never entered the tournament again, but they did eventually get to play their fixture against Queen's Park. In 1972, the centenary year of the first final, Queen's Park played a team of pupils from Donington School at Hampden Park. They thrashed the school team 6-0. That will teach them. Reigate Priory. Another team who entered to compete in the first FA Cup, but failed to fulfill their first round fixture, were Surrey-based Reigate Priory FC. They were a relatively new club at the time compared to some of the founding members of the FA, being formed in 1870. They don't have a rich history in the competition, but the club still exists today, and still plays at their original football ground. The first few teams saw the tournament as a bit of a novelty, and entered on the off chance of it being a bit of fun, but there were some teams that took it more seriously. Civil Service FC. You'd probably be hard-pressed to find a more boring-sounding football club name than Civil Service FC. Originally formed by public sector employees as a leisure club to relax and play sports in their spare time, they have the distinction of being founder members of both the Football Association and the Rugby Football Union. Remarkably, they are still active members of the FA more than 150 years later. Their FA Cup record is pretty unspectacular. They lost 2-0 in the first round and never entered again. The team is celebrated more for its evangelism for the sports of football and rugby in Europe, touring the continent and playing several fixtures against local teams including the now mighty Real Madrid. Barnes FC. The team that knocked Civil Service out in the first round were southwest London-based club, Barnes FC, who made history as the first team to win a game in the FA Cup. Like many early football clubs, they were born out of an existing sports club, in this case, a rowing club. A founder member of the FA, several key figures in the early days of the Football Association had ties to this club, including founder Ebenezer Cobb Morley himself. They competed in the first 15 FA Cup competitions but somewhat faded into history afterwards. There are patchy references to a club from Barnes playing various sports throughout the 20th century, mainly rugby. The football club was officially re-established in 2021 and is currently associated with the Surrey FA. Maybe we will see this historic club back in the FA Cup again in the future. Maidenhead. Berkshire-based Maidenhead has one significant claim to fame. Their ground, York Road, is the oldest continuously used football ground in the world, now the home of their successor club, Maidenhead United. They were competitive in the early days of the FA Cup, reaching the quarter-finals on a few occasions. The team has been semi-pro for most of its existence and even competed in the National League, the fifth tier of the English game, as recently as 2020. Marlow FC. Buckinghamshire club Marlow FC is another club with a unique claim to fame. Marlow are the only club from the original tournament that has entered the FA Cup every single year, under the exact same name. The war years aside, Marlow have entered the FA Cup without fail. In the first FA Cup they lost in the first round to Maidenhead despite boasting the considerable talents of Cuthbert Ottaway, who would go on to captain England. Their standout achievement was reaching the semi-finals of the tournament in 1882. The club still exists today, playing in the Southern League. Hitchin. Hitchin reached the quarter-finals that first year, holding Crystal Palace to a 0-0 draw in the first round. Both teams were allowed to advance but, unfortunately for Hitchin, they were demolished 5-0 by the Royal Engineers in the next round. Crystal Palace got the better side of the bargain, being drawn against Maidenhead, who they saw off easily. The original Hitchin FC eventually dissolved in 1911, but they left a mark. Hitchin Town, established in 1928 and still going strong, is their spiritual successor. Like Maidenhead United, they still play on the ground of their predecessor club. This was their one and only FA Cup appearance under their original name, but their successor, Hitchin Town, has replicated their feat of reaching the second round twice. Upton Park. London-based Upton Park, surprisingly, have nothing to do with the famous Boleyn Ground football stadium that was home to West Ham United for over a century. They did, however, help to popularise football in the region, drawing huge crowds to their games in the local parks. Despite them being one of the bigger hitters in the first tournament, the FA Cup was never really their strong point. In fact, they weren't largely successful in competitions in general. They achieved a much more famous success in the 1900 Olympic Games where, despite their apparent mediocrity, they were chosen to represent Great Britain. They proceeded to win the tournament. Unfortunately, as football was just an exhibition sport at the Games, they didn't win a gold medal. Their lasting impact on the sport came in unusual circumstances. During the 1884 FA Cup, they were drawn against Preston North End. Upton Park, being a proud amateur team, were dismayed to discover that Preston were fielding some paid professionals, something they felt went against the ethos of the tournament. Their subsequent complaints brought the concept of legalizing professionalism in the sport to the table. The rest, as they say, is history. A reformed version of the club were given the honour of playing the last game at the Boleyn Ground, where they took on 19th-century rivals Royal Engineers. Now we come to the real titans of that first tournament. Crystal Palace. No, not that one. This is the original Crystal Palace that were associated with the famous exhibition hall of the same name. Though they only entered the first few tournaments, they were instrumental in the conception of the tournament and its success. Described as one of the four pillars of the Football Association, they were highly active in the establishment of the FA and the development of the rules of association football. They played their games at the cricket ground on the Palace grounds, which also hosted FA Cup finals in its own right years later. By 1875 they were struggling to raise a team and find a venue for their matches. Many Palace players started turning out for Wanderers instead. The modern club, Crystal Palace FC, claims descendancy from the original incarnation. If proven, this would make Crystal Palace FC the oldest professional club in the world. The FA itself does not recognise the connection between the two clubs. Clapham Rovers. Future FA Cup winners Clapham Rovers were based in South London, playing on various common lands and drawn primarily from middle-class hobbyists rather than the wealthy elite. Like many early clubs, they were more of a general sports club than a pure football team and attracted sportsmen from many backgrounds including rowing, rugby and cricket. In the first tournament they saw off Upton Park in the first round before being unluckily drawn against the all-conquering Wanderers in the second. This wasn't their year, but that would come 8 years later when they lifted the cup, forever cementing their legacy as a pointless answer in quiz competitions about FA Cup winners. Queen's Park. Queen's Park FC from Glasgow already had a huge reputation by the time they arrived for the FA Cup. They are often credited with inventing the modern passing game, the Scottish style, although the Royal Engineers would certainly have something to say about that. Nonetheless, they were undisputedly a standout team of skillful players, many of whom had represented Scotland in the first international fixtures. Probably thinking they were doing the FA a favour by agreeing to step in, Queen's Park had a pretty cushy time in the first FA Cup tournament. They reached the semi-finals without even playing a minute of football. Byes and walkovers carried them there. In their first actual game, they drew 0-0 with Wanderers at the Oval. This match was not portrayed as the clash of styles you might expect. Both teams played an attacking game based on individual brilliance in the gentlemanly tradition. Perhaps fortunately for Wanderers, the Scottish team couldn't afford to travel back to London for the replay and withdrew. Who knows? Maybe if the FA had stumped up the cost of the fare, history might have been different. Of course, the team still plays in the Scottish League system today and remained amateur until very recently. Royal Engineers. The Royal Engineers were built differently. They were pioneers of the combination game in England, arguably long before the style emerged in Scotland. They used military discipline, short passing, and teamwork to dismantle the individual skill of the dribbling sides. They reached that first FA Cup final without conceding a single goal. In the final, they lost 1-0 to Wanderers, hampered by a serious injury, early on, that rendered one of their players ineffective. The fact the Wanderers played exceptionally well in the game and still only beat the Engineers 1-0 says a lot about their character. 4 years later, they got their moment when they won the cup outright. They also got their ultimate revenge on the Wanderers 140 years later when they thrashed them 7-1 in a commemorative match at the Kennington Oval. The team still exists today, proudly boasting the trophy on their club badge. Finally, the winners. Wanderers. Led by C.W. Alcock himself, the man who invented the competition, they won the first FA Cup and developed a taste for victory. That is, once they actually got their hands on the trophy, which wasn't hoisted aloft at the Kennington Oval that day, but awarded at a reception several weeks later. They won 5 of the first 7 tournaments, including 3 consecutive wins, a feat matched only by Blackburn Rovers a decade later. They came, they conquered, they disappeared. The club dissolved in 1887, the fiercely amateur old boys team becoming an anachronism in an increasingly organised and professional game. They didn't live to see the founding of the Football League, let alone compete in it. Better to burn out than fade away, as they say. A number of renowned players of the age turned out in the mesmerising, colourful jersey of the Wanderers. Famous names of the early days of the sport: Arthur Kinnaird, Charles Wollaston, Henry Wace, even W.G. Grace, the legendary cricketer, turned out for the club on occasion. True to their origins, the Wanderers name has been used unofficially by teams of Harrow alumni over the years, and a revival club was created in 2009. This was the team that the Royal Engineers put to the sword in 2012. As chaotic as the first Football Association Challenge Cup was, it proved the concept that organised competitions for football could be a success. This has only been vindicated by the passage of time, with that same tournament now being considered one of the most prestigious in world football. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed learning about the quirky origins of the FA Cup and the teams that made it happen, hit that subscribe button and share this video. We've got plenty more old school football stories waiting for you. Until next time.